Why is this ungrateful parasite still here? My mother's voice cut through the Sunday dinner like a blade through silk. I looked up from the financial documents spread across my lap, met her furious eyes and smiled. Then I reached into my bag and handed her an envelope. "I think this answers your question," I said quietly. Her hands trembled as she opened it, and I watched the color drain from her face as she read the first page. 23 years of questions were about to get their answers. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. But before I explain what was inside that envelope, and how a Sunday dinner turned into the most important confrontation of my life, I need you to do something for me. Hit that like button and tell me in the comments if you have ever been called ungrateful by the very people who should have protected you. Have you ever been made to feel like a burden in the place you called home? Your stories matter because they remind all of us that we are not alone in these struggles. And sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones who were supposed to love us unconditionally. Everyone in our Connecticut suburb knew the Whitmore family. We lived in a restored Victorian on Elmwood Avenue, the kind of house that appeared in local tourism brochures showcasing New England charm. My mother Patricia hosted garden parties that the neighborhood association praised in their newsletters. My father David served on the hospital board and played golf every Saturday with other successful cardiologists. From the outside, we looked like the embodiment of the American dream achieved through hard work and strong family values. The truth, as it so often does, lived in the spaces between the carefully curated appearances. I was the eldest daughter, born when my parents were still establishing themselves financially and professionally. My mother often reminded me that my arrival had complicated her plans to complete her graduate degree in art history. She had been 24 years old and pregnant with me when my father was still a medical resident working 100-hour weeks. According to family mythology that she recited at various gatherings, she had sacrificed her academic ambitions to raise me while he built his career. My sister Victoria arrived 6 years later, after my father had established his practice and my mother had time to prepare for motherhood on her own terms. Victoria was planned, wanted, celebrated in ways that apparently I had not been. She was the golden child from the moment she drew her first breath, showered with attention and resources that seemed to flow naturally in her direction. I learned early not to compare or question this disparity, asking why Victoria received piano lessons while I was told we could not afford them, or why her college applications received professional consultant guidance while I filled mine out alone at the public library, was labeled as jealousy and ingratitude. The word ungrateful became a weapon my mother wielded with precision throughout my childhood and adolescence. If I asked for help with homework, I was ungrateful for the education they provided by living in a good school district. If I needed money for school activities, I was ungrateful for the roof over my head and food on the table. If I expressed any disappointment or hurt, I was ungrateful for parents who stayed married when so many others divorced. Gratitude, I learned, was not an emotion but rather an impossible debt that grew larger with every breath I took. I became useful by becoming invisible. I learned to anticipate needs before they were voiced, to solve problems before they were acknowledged, to make myself valuable through service since I apparently could not be valued simply for existing. At 12 years old, I was managing the household finances because my mother found spreadsheets tedious. At 15, I was coordinating my father's medical practice scheduling because his office manager quit, and he needed temporary help that turned permanent. At 17, I was planning Victoria's birthday parties and helping her with college essays because everyone agreed I had a talent for organization and writing. The pattern continued into adulthood with a momentum that felt inevitable. I attended the state university rather than the private colleges that accepted me, because my parents explained that they needed to save resources for Victoria's education at the prestigious institution she deserved. I chose accounting as my major not from passion but from practicality, understanding that I needed to become financially independent as quickly as possible. I graduated with honors and immediately found work at a regional firm where my attention to detail and tireless work ethic earned rapid promotions. But even as I built my own career in life, the gravitational pull of family obligation never weakened. My parents called when they needed help with tax preparation, estate planning, or financial analysis for my father's practice. I provided this assistance without charge because family does not bill family, or so I was constantly reminded. When they decided to renovate the Victorian house, I helped secure construction loans and managed contractor relations because my mother found the process overwhelming. When my father considered expanding his medical practice, I created the business plan and financial projections that secured investor funding. Every contribution was acknowledged with the same phrase that had echoed through my childhood. We appreciate your help, but this is what family does for each other. The unspoken addition was always present in the silence that followed. You owe us this because we gave you life and you have never done enough to repay that debt. Victoria, meanwhile, drifted through her 20s with the buoyancy of someone who had never been asked to justify her existence. She changed majors 3 times during her 6 years of undergraduate education, all funded entirely by our parents. She moved home after graduation and lived rent-free, while pursuing various creative projects that never quite materialized into careers. She borrowed money for a business venture that failed within 8 months, the loan quietly forgiven without discussion of repayment. She was never called a parasite or a burden. She was artistic, sensitive, still finding herself. The turning point came 3 years ago when my father had a health scare that revealed the precarious state of their finances. I was 35 years old at the time, established in my career as a senior financial analyst, and living independently in a modest apartment 40 minutes away. My father called me from the hospital after his cardiac episode, not to share his medical condition but to ask if I could review some documents from his accountant. What I discovered when I examined those documents shocked me into a new understanding of my entire family dynamic. My parents were deeply in debt despite my father's substantial income. They had taken out a second mortgage on the Victorian house to fund renovations that increased its value on paper, but cost far more than the equity gained. They had invested poorly in several business ventures that promised quick returns but delivered only losses. They had borrowed against my father's retirement accounts to maintain a lifestyle that appeared successful, while the foundation crumbled beneath the surface. Most devastating was the discovery that they had taken out a life insurance policy on me without my knowledge or consent, naming themselves as beneficiaries. When I confronted them about the insurance policy, my mother explained it away with casual cruelty. You have no husband, no children. If something happened to you, we would be responsible for funeral costs and estate settlement. This simply protects us from that burden. The word burden landed like a physical blow. I was not their daughter in that moment but rather a potential financial liability to be hedged against. That night I went home to my apartment and did what I do best. I began documenting everything with the systematic precision that my career had trained into me. I created a comprehensive spreadsheet tracking every hour of unpaid labor I had provided to my parents over the past 20 years. I assigned conservative hourly rates based on what professionals in each field would charge. Tax preparation and financial planning at $150 per hour. Business consulting at $200 per hour. Project management for their renovations at $125 per hour. Personal assistance and administrative support at $75 per hour. I gathered every email, every text message, every written request they had made for my help. I documented the dates, the nature of the work, the hours invested, and the outcomes achieved. I researched the fair market value of services I had provided and created detailed invoices for each category of assistance. I calculated compound interest on the value of services rendered over time. The total, when I finally completed the analysis after 3 months of meticulous work, was staggering. At conservative estimates, I had provided $467,000 worth of professional services to my parents over the course of 20 years. But documentation of services rendered was only the beginning of what I needed to build my case. I also began investigating their treatment of Victoria compared to their treatment of me. I obtained records of college tuition payments, living expenses covered, loans forgiven, gifts given. I documented every family gathering where my accomplishments were minimized while Victoria's minor achievements were celebrated. I saved every email and voice message where I was asked to help, contrasted with the complete absence of similar requests made to my sister. I consulted with 3 different attorneys over the course of 18 months, presenting them with my documentation and asking whether I had any legal recourse for the financial exploitation I believed I had experienced. 2 of them told me that family dynamics were complicated and legal action would be difficult to pursue. The third attorney, a woman named Rebecca Chun who specialized in elder abuse and family financial exploitation, looked at my documentation with growing interest and finally said something that changed my perspective entirely. "You are not seeking legal recourse," she explained carefully. "You are seeking acknowledgement and boundaries. What you have built here is not a lawsuit. It is leverage. The question is what you want to use that leverage to achieve." She helped me understand that my goal was not to destroy my parents financially, or even necessarily to collect on the debt they owed me. My goal was to establish my worth, to force recognition of my contributions, and to create boundaries that would prevent future exploitation. Together we crafted a strategy that was elegant in its simplicity. I would present my parents with a comprehensive accounting of the value I had provided to them over 2 decades. I would include a detailed analysis of the disparate treatment between myself and Victoria, not as a complaint but as evidence of a pattern. I would offer them a choice. They could acknowledge this debt and agree to specific boundaries going forward, including equal treatment of both daughters and an end to unpaid labor expectations, or I would begin billing them professionally for any future services and would pursue legal remedies for past exploitation. The envelope that I prepared contained a 30-page document that Rebecca helped me structure for maximum impact. The first page was a cover letter that summarized the contents in clear, unemotional language. The 2nd through 15th pages contained the detailed accounting of services rendered with dates, descriptions, hourly rates, and total values. The 16th through 22nd pages contained the comparative analysis of financial support provided to Victoria versus support provided to me. The final pages contain the proposed agreement for future interactions, including specific boundaries and consequences for violations. I carried that envelope with me for 2 months, waiting for the right moment to present it. I needed the moment to be public enough that my parents could not simply dismiss it privately, but intimate enough that they would feel the full weight of what I was presenting. I needed them to be surrounded by the trappings of the life they had built partially on my unpaid labor, so they could see clearly what they risked losing if they refused to acknowledge reality. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The moment arrived on a Sunday in late September when my parents hosted what they called a family strategy session. They had gathered Victoria and myself for dinner to discuss their estate planning, and to inform us of decisions they had made about inheritance and end-of-life care. I knew from the formal tone of the invitation that this was going to be a presentation rather than a discussion, another instance of them informing us of decisions made without our input but with expectations of our compliance. I arrived at the Victorian house that afternoon carrying my professional briefcase, which drew an amused look from my mother. "Are you coming from work?" she asked with the faint condescension that implied I was being unnecessarily formal for a family dinner. I smiled and said nothing, taking my seat at the dining room table where my father had already laid out various legal documents related to their estate plan. The dinner itself was an exercise in familiar dynamics. My mother had prepared an elaborate meal that she described in detail, emphasizing the effort and expense involved. My father held forth on various topics from his medical practice and recent golf games. Victoria talked about her latest creative project, a photography series she was developing with funding from our parents. I was largely silent, eating mechanically while my mind rehearsed what was coming. After dessert was served, my father cleared his throat and began his presentation about estate planning decisions. They had decided to leave the Victorian house to Victoria because she had always loved it more, and because they trusted her to preserve its character. I would receive the equivalent value from other assets, primarily retirement accounts that would not be accessible without significant tax penalties for years. They had established a trust for Victoria's benefit that would provide her with income support until she established her career. No such trust existed for me because I had already demonstrated financial independence and did not need similar assistance. The message was clear and had been clear my entire life. Victoria was the beloved daughter who required protection and support. I was the capable workhorse who required nothing because I had never been given the option to require anything. As my father concluded his presentation and looked at me expectantly for acknowledgement and agreement, my mother added the line that became the catalyst for everything that followed. "I suppose you will have questions and concerns because you always do, but we expect you to understand that we have made these decisions carefully, and they reflect what is best for the entire family. We have given you every opportunity in life, and we expect gratitude rather than complaints. Why is this ungrateful parasite still here questioning decisions that do not concern her? The word parasite hung in the air like poison. Victoria looked uncomfortable but said nothing. My father frowned slightly but did not contradict my mother, and I felt something inside me that had been bent for 38 years finally snap clean through. I reached into my briefcase, withdrew the envelope that I had been carrying for 2 months, and placed it on the table in front of my mother. I think this answers your question, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. Everything you need to know about this ungrateful parasite is in that envelope. I suggest you read it carefully before we continue this conversation. My mother opened the envelope with an expression of irritation that gradually transformed into shock as she began reading the cover letter. My father leaned over to read alongside her, and I watched as comprehension dawned on their faces. Victoria asked what was happening, but I simply told her to wait while our parents reviewed the document. The silence in that dining room stretched for several minutes as they read through page after page of documentation. I watched my mother's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been shame before settling on defensive outrage. My father's expression was harder to read, but his hands trembled slightly as he turned the pages. When they finally reached the end and looked up at me, I was ready with the speech I had rehearsed dozens of times. You have called me ungrateful for as long as I can remember, I began, keeping my voice calm and professional. You have treated me as a burden and an obligation rather than as a daughter. You have taken my labor and my expertise for granted while showering Victoria with support and resources you never extended to me. This ends today. You can choose to acknowledge what is documented in that envelope and agree to the boundaries going forward, or you can choose to refuse and face the consequences I have outlined. But you will never again call me ungrateful or a parasite because I have the receipts that prove exactly who has been parasitic in this relationship. My mother's face flushed red with anger. How dare you speak to us this way after everything we have done for you? We gave you life. We raised you. We provided for you. Her voice rose with each sentence until she was nearly shouting. I met her anger with cold factual precision. You provided the legal minimum required of parents. I provided $467,000 worth of professional services without compensation. The math is quite clear about who owes whom. What happened next would reshape our family permanently and teach me the most important lesson I have ever learned about self-worth and boundaries. But that part of the story requires understanding how the confrontation unfolded, what choices my parents made, and how I enforced the boundaries I had finally drawn after a lifetime of being treated as less than I was worth. The envelope was just the beginning of a process that would take months to fully resolve. But in that moment when I watched my mother read the accounting of her exploitation and my father confront the evidence of his complicity, I felt something I had not experienced in my entire life. I felt powerful. Not because I was destroying them, but because I was finally, definitively, establishing that I had value independent of their recognition or approval. The silence that followed my statement stretched into something almost physical, a weight pressing down on the dining room that had witnessed so many performances of family harmony over the years. My father set down the envelope with careful deliberation, as though it contained something volatile that might detonate if handled roughly. My mother remained frozen in her chair, her mouth opening and closing without producing sound, a woman accustomed to controlling narratives suddenly finding herself confronted with a story she could not rewrite. Victoria broke the tension by asking the question that hung between us all. What exactly is in those documents? Her voice carried genuine confusion rather than defensiveness, which was perhaps the only grace note in an otherwise discordant moment. She had benefited from the family dynamics without necessarily understanding the cost those dynamics had extracted from me. And I found I could not direct anger toward someone who had simply accepted what was freely offered to her. I turned to address my sister directly, keeping my tone measured and factual. Those documents contain a comprehensive accounting of every professional service I have provided to our parents over the past 20 years. Tax preparation, financial planning, business consulting, project management, estate analysis, and countless hours of administrative work that would have cost them several $100,000 if they had hired professionals. The documents also contain a detailed comparison of the financial support, emotional investment, and opportunities provided to you versus what was provided to me. Finally, they outline the boundaries I am establishing going forward and the consequences if those boundaries are violated. My father found his voice first, though it emerged strained and defensive. This is absurd. You are our daughter. Families help each other without keeping score. What you are describing as exploitation is simply normal family dynamics. Adult children assist their aging parents. This is how families function. I had anticipated this response and had prepared for it during the months of documentation and strategy development. I opened my briefcase again and withdrew a second folder containing additional materials I had brought as supplementary evidence. Normal family dynamics involve reciprocity and appreciation. Normal families do not refer to their daughters as parasites. Normal families do not establish life insurance policies on their children without consent and refer to those children as financial burdens. Normal families do not provide vastly disparate levels of support to siblings based on favoritism rather than need. I slid the second folder across the table toward my father. This folder contains documentation of the life insurance policy you established on me without my knowledge, the policy documents that list me as a potential funeral cost liability, and recordings of conversations where you have discussed my value to this family purely in transactional terms. I have been recording family gatherings for the past 2 years with a device in my purse because I knew that my memory of events would be disputed and dismissed without proof. Every conversation where I was diminished, every request for unpaid labor, every comparison between Victoria and myself that positioned me as less worthy of investment, all of it is documented. My mother's shock transformed into fury as she processed what I was telling her. You recorded us? In our own home? That is a violation of trust and privacy. That is betrayal. Her voice shook with outrage that would have been more credible if she had not just called me a parasite minutes earlier. I met her anger with calm precision. Connecticut is a one-party consent state for recordings. I was present for every conversation I recorded, which makes the recordings legal. As for trust and betrayal, I invite you to reflect on which of us has actually violated those principles over the course of my lifetime. I documented everything because I knew that without proof, my experiences would be rewritten and denied. You have spent 38 years telling me that my perceptions were wrong, that my hurt was unjustified, that my expectations were unreasonable. I needed proof that would be impossible to dismiss or reinterpret. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that made Victoria flinch. He was a man accustomed to authority in his professional life, a physician whose diagnoses and treatment plans were rarely questioned by patients who trusted his expertise and experience. But in this moment, confronted with documentation that challenged his self-perception as a good father and provider, he defaulted to the anger that often masks shame in men who cannot admit error. I will not sit here and be accused of exploitation by my own daughter. We have given you everything. We paid for your education at a good university. We provided a home and stability throughout your childhood. We have welcomed you into our lives and our home as an adult. If you have chosen to help us with various matters over the years, that was your choice. No one forced you to do anything. This attempt to retroactively bill us for what were gifts freely given is manipulative and frankly disgusting. I remained seated, keeping my posture relaxed and my voice steady. Matching his anger with anger would have played into decades of established patterns where my emotions were dismissed as irrational while his were considered justified responses to provocation. Instead, I responded with the kind of clinical detachment I used when presenting financial analyses to skeptical clients who did not want to hear uncomfortable truths about their fiscal situations. Let me address each of those points systematically. First, you paid for my education at the state university after I was accepted to several private institutions that would have provided superior academic opportunities. You made that decision based on your need to reserve financial resources for Victoria's education at a more expensive school. That is documented in emails between the two of you that I obtained through the family email account I was managing at the time for estate planning purposes. Second, providing a home and stability for a minor child is the legal minimum required of parents, not evidence of exceptional generosity. Third, every request for my professional assistance was framed as a family obligation with implicit consequences for refusal. I have emails where you suggested that my willingness to help would be remembered when estate planning decisions were made. That is not a freely given gift. That is coerced labor with transactional expectations clearly stated. I paused to let those facts settle before continuing. Finally, the estate plan you presented tonight demonstrates exactly what I have documented. Victoria receives the house and a trust fund providing ongoing income support. I receive retirement accounts with substantial tax penalties and no equivalent ongoing support. The disparity is not based on need since I am financially stable and Victoria is not. The disparity is based on favoritism that has been consistent throughout our lives. You are welcome to make whatever estate decisions you wish. You are not welcome to expect my continued unpaid labor, while simultaneously treating me as less worthy of consideration than my sister. Victoria had been listening to this exchange with growing distress, her eyes moving between our parents and me as though watching a tennis match where the stakes were our family's continued existence. She spoke quietly but with an edge of desperation. Can we please just calm down and discuss this rationally? This does not need to destroy our family. Maybe there has been some miscommunication or misunderstanding that we can work through. I turned to my sister with genuine affection mixed with sadness. Victoria had always been the peacekeeper, the one who smoothed over conflicts and encouraged everyone to get along, largely because she had never been the target of the dynamics that required peacekeeping. Her desire for harmony was understandable, but it ignored the reality that some conflicts cannot be resolved through politeness and compromise, when the fundamental issue is whether one person's humanity will be acknowledged. Victoria, I love you and I do not hold you responsible for the choices our parents made about how to treat us differently. You were a child and then a young adult receiving what parents should provide. You did nothing wrong by accepting their support. But this is not a misunderstanding or miscommunication. This is a pattern of exploitation and favoritism that has been consistent for decades. I am not trying to destroy our family. I am trying to establish boundaries that recognize my worth and prevent future exploitation. Those are different things, though they may feel similar to people who benefited from the old arrangement. My mother had been reading through the envelope's contents more carefully while this conversation unfolded, and her expression shifted from outrage to something more calculating. She was a woman who had managed social dynamics and appearances her entire adult life, someone who understood instinctively how to position narratives for maximum advantage. I watched her mind work through the implications of what I was presenting and calculate potential responses. These documents you have prepared are clearly the work of months, possibly years. You have been planning this confrontation, gathering evidence, building a case against us while pretending to be a loving daughter. That level of deception and manipulation suggests that perhaps we were not wrong to be cautious about your motivations. Her voice had shifted from shouting to something colder and more controlled, the tone she used when she wanted to wound precisely rather than broadly. I had also anticipated this line of attack because it was consistent with decades of having my reality reframed as mental instability or malicious intent whenever I challenged the family narrative. I responded with facts rather than defending my character, understanding that the documentation would be more persuasive than any emotional appeal. I began systematic documentation 3 years ago, after discovering the life insurance policy you established on me without my consent. That discovery made me realize that I needed proof of the patterns I had experienced, because my memories and perceptions would be dismissed as exaggeration or misunderstanding. The fact that you are now attempting to reframe my self-protection as manipulation proves exactly why documentation was necessary. You are demonstrating in real time the gaslighting that has characterized our relationship for my entire life. My father sat back down heavily, his earlier anger giving way to something that looked like exhaustion. He was 68 years old and had recently faced his own mortality through the cardiac episode that first revealed their financial troubles. I wondered if some part of him recognized the truth in what I was presenting but could not acknowledge it without dismantling his self-image as a good father and provider. Pride and shame are powerful forces that prevent people from seeing themselves clearly, and my father had always had an abundance of both. "What exactly do you want from us?" he asked finally, his voice stripped of the defensive bluster. "You have made your point. You have documented grievances and calculated the value of assistance you provided. What outcome are you seeking with this confrontation?" This was the crucial moment that Rebecca-chan and I had discussed extensively during our strategy sessions. I needed to be clear about my objectives without being punitive, firm about boundaries without being vindictive, factual about the past without being cruel about the future. The goal was not destruction but rather reconstruction of a relationship on terms that recognized my full humanity and worth. I pulled out another document from my briefcase, a single page that I had revised dozens of times to capture the essential elements of what I needed going forward. I want 4 things, all of which are outlined in the final section of the documentation I provided. First, I want written acknowledgement from both of you that the professional services I provided over the past 20 years had significant monetary value, and that my contributions to this family have been substantial. Second, I want equal treatment going forward in all family financial matters, including estate planning. Third, I want an end to expectations of unpaid labor. If you need professional services in the future, you will hire professionals or you will compensate me at market rates. Fourth, I want an end to diminishing language and comparisons that position me as less valuable than Victoria. I slid the single page across the table. This document formalizes those 4 requirements. If you sign it and honor it, we can rebuild our relationship on healthier terms. If you refuse to sign it or you sign it and violate it, I will begin billing you retroactively for the past services documented in that envelope. I have consulted with attorneys who confirm that I have grounds for legal action based on unjust enrichment and quantum merit principles. I do not want to pursue legal action against my own parents, but I will do so if necessary to establish that my worth is not negotiable. My mother read the document with an expression of disbelief. You are actually threatening to sue us. Your own parents. The people who gave you life and raised you. Do you understand how this will look to everyone who knows our family? Do you understand the damage this will cause to our reputation and relationships? I smiled without humor at her invocation of reputation and appearances, the values that had always mattered most to her. I understand that you are more concerned about how this looks to outsiders than about how it feels to me. That has always been the problem. You care deeply about the appearance of family harmony, and much less about the reality of family health. But to answer your question directly, I do not care how this looks to others. I care about establishing boundaries that allow me to have a relationship with you that does not require me to diminish myself. If reputation matters more to you than relationship, then you will refuse to sign and we will proceed accordingly. Victoria had tears streaming down her face as she listened to this exchange, and I felt genuine sorrow for her distress even as I remained committed to the course I had set. She was losing the illusion of family that she had believed in, and that loss was painful even though the illusion had always been false. I reached across the table to take her hand, offering physical comfort even as I maintained emotional distance from our parents. I am sorry you are caught in the middle of this. You did not create these dynamics and you are not responsible for resolving them. I want you to know that my love for you is not conditional on our parents' choices or your response to this situation. Whatever happens going forward, you are my sister and that matters to me. My words were genuine and seemed to provide some small comfort as Victoria squeezed my hand and nodded through her tears. My father picked up the single-page agreement and read it several times, his expression unreadable. He was the more pragmatic of my parents, someone who understood that legal documents and formal agreements carried weight that verbal promises did not. He was also someone who had spent a career making risk-benefit calculations about treatment plans and patient care. I watched him apply that same analytical framework to the choice I was presenting. If we sign this, what happens to the documentation you have gathered? Do you destroy it or do you retain it as ongoing leverage? His question was tactical rather than emotional, seeking to understand the full scope of what he was agreeing to before committing. I appreciated the directness of the question because it allowed me to be equally direct in response. I retained the documentation indefinitely as proof that this agreement was necessary, and as protection against future gaslighting about whether the patterns I documented actually occurred. The documentation exists to establish truth, not as ongoing blackmail. If you honor this agreement, the documentation remains private and unused. If you violate this agreement, the documentation becomes the foundation for legal action. The choice about how the documentation is ultimately used rests entirely with you based on your future behavior. My mother stood abruptly, her chair falling backward with a crash that made everyone jump. Her face was flushed and her hands were trembling as she pointed at me with shaking finger. I will not be threatened in my own home by my own daughter. I will not sign anything that validates this fantasy you have constructed about being exploited and undervalued. You have always been difficult, always been ungrateful, always been determined to paint yourself as a victim. This is just the latest manifestation of your need for attention and validation. I think you should leave. I had known this moment was possible, and had prepared myself emotionally for rejection of my boundaries. Some part of me had hoped that confronted with undeniable evidence, my parents would choose relationship over pride. But another part of me, the part that had been documenting and preparing for 3 years, had understood that people who exploit others rarely acknowledge their exploitation willingly. They convince themselves that they are entitled to what they take and that resistance to their entitlement is betrayal. I stood calmly and began gathering my materials, placing the folders and documents back into my briefcase with methodical care. My hands were steady even though my heart was racing. This was the moment of commitment, the point at which I would discover whether my preparation was sufficient and my resolve was genuine. Everything that had come before was planning. Everything that came after would be action and consequence. I am leaving because you have asked me to, not because I am retreating from anything I have presented tonight. You have 1 week to review those documents, discuss them with each other and with Victoria if you choose, and make your decision about whether you will sign the agreement. After 1 week, if I have not received a signed agreement, I will retain the attorney I have consulted with, and we will proceed with formal legal action. I hope you will choose relationship over pride, but that choice is yours to make. I walked to the door of the dining room and paused to look back at the 3 of them. My father sat slumped in his chair looking older than his years. My mother stood rigid with fury that barely masked something that might have been fear. Victoria remained at the table with tears still flowing, caught between her love for her sister and her loyalty to our parents. The Victorian house that had always represented their achievement and status suddenly looked like what it actually was, a beautiful structure built on a foundation that had never been as solid as it appeared. I love all of you, which is why I am doing this. Healthy relationships require honesty and boundaries. I am offering both. How you respond will determine what our family becomes going forward. With those final words, I walked out of the house where I had learned to make myself small, got into my car, and drove away from the life I had known toward the one I was claiming for myself. The drive home from my parents' house took 40 minutes through evening traffic, but I barely registered the familiar route or the other vehicles surrounding me on the highway. My hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity, and my mind replayed the confrontation in an endless loop, analyzing every word spoken and every reaction observed. The adrenaline that had sustained me through the evening was beginning to fade, leaving behind a trembling exhaustion that made my entire body feel like it weighed twice its normal mass. I had prepared for this confrontation for 3 years, had rehearsed my statements and anticipated their responses, had built documentation so comprehensive that it could withstand any challenge. But preparation had not fully equipped me for the emotional reality of watching my mother's face contort with rage as she ordered me from her home, or seeing my father age a decade in the span of an hour as he confronted evidence that contradicted his self-image, or witnessing Victoria's tears as the family mythology she had believed in crumbled around her. When I finally reached my apartment and locked the door behind me, the professional composure I had maintained throughout the evening shattered completely. I slid down to sit on the floor with my back against the door, and for the first time in years I allowed myself to cry without restraint or self-consciousness. The tears were not solely about the confrontation that had just occurred, but rather about the accumulated grief of 38 years spent trying to earn love that should have been freely given, trying to prove worth that should have been inherent, trying to make myself valuable enough to deserve the basic consideration that every child should receive from their parents. The grief eventually exhausted itself, leaving me hollow but strangely calm. I retrieved my phone from my briefcase and found 17 missed calls from Victoria, and 6 text messages asking if I was safe and begging me to call her. I appreciated her concern, but I was not yet ready to discuss what had happened or to explain my actions to someone who had never experienced the dynamics I was challenging. Instead, I sent a brief text assuring her I was home and safe, that I loved her, and that I would be available to talk when she felt ready, but that I needed some time alone first. I spent that first evening after the confrontation doing something I had not allowed myself to do during the 3 years of documentation and preparation. I let myself imagine what my life might look like if my parents refused to sign the agreement and I proceeded with legal action. The thought was simultaneously terrifying and liberating. terrifying because it meant permanently fracturing family relationships and facing the social judgment that comes with suing one's own parents. Liberating because it meant finally, definitively, establishing that I would no longer accept treatment that diminished my humanity and worth. Rebecca-chan had warned me during our strategy sessions that the week following my ultimatum would be the most difficult period of the entire process. My parents would need time to move through their initial emotional reactions and reach the point where they could make rational decisions about their options. During that week, they would likely attempt various strategies to regain control of the narrative and avoid accountability. She had outlined the most common tactics that parents employ when adult children establish boundaries, after years of exploitation. The first tactic would be silence, an attempt to make me anxious enough about the severed relationship that I would reach out to them and undermine my own ultimatum. The second would be triangulation through Victoria, using my sister as a messenger to convey their hurt and anger while avoiding direct confrontation with me. The third would be reputation management within the extended family and social circle, telling their version of events to create social pressure for me to back down. The fourth would be minimization and gaslighting, attempting to reframe the confrontation as an overreaction to minor misunderstandings, rather than a legitimate response to documented patterns. Rebecca had advised me to prepare for all of these tactics by establishing firm boundaries and maintaining consistent communication discipline. I was not to initiate contact with my parents during the 1-week period I had given them to decide. I was not to discuss the confrontation with extended family members who might relay information back to my parents. I was not to allow Victoria to serve as a go-between carrying messages in either direction. I was to document any contact attempts they made, preserving evidence of their response pattern for potential future legal proceedings. The first 3 days after the confrontation passed in eerie silence. My parents made no attempt to contact me directly, which suggested they were either still processing their shock and anger, or they were consulting their own attorney to assess their legal exposure. Victoria called me twice and sent numerous text messages, but I maintained the boundary I had established by responding only with brief reassurances that I was well, and that I would be happy to talk with her about anything except messages from our parents or attempts to mediate the situation. On the 4th day, the silence broke in exactly the way Rebecca had predicted. My Aunt Margaret, my mother's older sister, called my cell phone number despite the fact that we had not spoken directly in over 2 years. Margaret was the matriarch of the extended family, a woman who valued appearance and propriety above almost everything else, and she had always been my mother's closest confidant and most loyal defender. I answered the call knowing exactly why she was reaching out, and determined to maintain my boundaries regardless of what emotional manipulation she might attempt. Margaret dispensed with pleasantries and moved directly to her objective. Her voice carried the tone of someone addressing a misbehaving child, rather than a nearly 40-year-old professional woman. She informed me that my mother had called her in tears, devastated by my accusations and threats, unable to understand how the daughter she had raised and loved could turn on her so viciously. According to Margaret's telling, I had presented my parents with outrageous demands based on misunderstandings and normal family interactions that I had chosen to interpret in the worst possible light. My parents were elderly and had recently faced health scares, and my timing showed a cruelty that was difficult for the family to comprehend. I listened to this recitation without interruption, taking notes on the key phrases and arguments Margaret was making because I knew this conversation was part of the reputation management strategy Rebecca had warned me about. When Margaret finally paused for breath and asked if I had anything to say in my defense, I responded with calm precision that made clear I would not be manipulated into justifying myself or negotiating through intermediaries. I thanked Margaret for her concern and informed her that the situation between my parents and myself involved documented facts rather than misunderstandings, that I had consulted with legal counsel before taking any action, and that the matter would be resolved directly between my parents and myself without involvement from extended family members. I explained that I understood she was calling from a place of loyalty to her sister, but that her intervention was neither helpful nor appropriate, and that I would not be discussing the details of the situation with anyone outside the immediate family members directly involved. Margaret responded with indignation that I would refuse to listen to the perspective of someone older and wiser, who had known me since birth, and who only wanted what was best for everyone involved. I replied that what was best for everyone involved was for boundaries to be respected, and for my parents to make their own decision about the agreement I had presented rather than enlisting family members to create pressure for me to withdraw my requirements. I ended the call politely but firmly, and immediately sent a text message to my parents informing them that I would not be accepting calls from extended family members about our situation, and that any further attempts to communicate through third parties would be documented as evidence of their unwillingness to engage directly with the boundaries I had established. The fifth day brought a different tactic. Victoria appeared at my apartment door in the evening, her eyes red from crying and her entire demeanor radiating distress. I had known this moment was coming and had prepared myself emotionally for the difficulty of maintaining boundaries with the one family member I genuinely loved and wanted to protect from the conflict. I invited her inside and made tea while she collected herself enough to speak coherently. Victoria explained that our parents had been in turmoil since the confrontation, that our mother was barely eating and our father had been drinking more than usual, that the house felt like a tomb filled with anger and recrimination. She understood that I had grievances and that some of my concerns were valid, but she believed that the way I had presented them was needlessly harsh, and that my ultimatum was backing our parents into a corner that made it impossible for them to respond with anything other than defensiveness. She begged me to consider extending the deadline, softening the requirements, finding some way to allow our parents to save face while still addressing my concerns. I listened to my sister with sympathy for her position, but I remained firm in my response. I explained that I had not backed our parents into a corner, but rather had finally refused to remain in the corner where I had been kept for most of my life. I acknowledged that the confrontation had been painful for everyone involved, but that pain was the necessary consequence of exposing truth that had been hidden beneath false harmony for decades. I told Victoria that I loved her and did not want her to suffer because of the conflict between our parents and myself, but that I would not negotiate away boundaries that protected my fundamental worth and dignity, simply to restore comfort for people who had never prioritized my comfort. Victoria cried harder as I spoke, and I held her while she processed the reality that I would not be moved from my position. She asked what would happen if our parents refused to sign the agreement, and I told her honestly that I would proceed with legal action despite the family rupture and social judgment that would result. She asked if there was anything she could do to help resolve the situation, and I told her that the most helpful thing she could do was to stay out of the middle, to refuse to carry messages between our parents and myself, and to support whichever decisions I made about how to handle my own relationship with them. When Victoria left my apartment several hours later, she seemed more settled though no less sad. I had not given her the reassurance she wanted that everything would work out and the family would heal, because I could not honestly provide that reassurance. What I had given her was clarity about my position and permission to prioritize her own well-being, rather than trying to fix a situation that was not her responsibility to resolve. I hoped that clarity would ultimately be more valuable to her than false comfort would have been. The sixth day brought the minimization and gaslighting tactic that Rebecca had predicted. My father called my cell phone in the afternoon, and I answered after a moment of hesitation because direct contact from one of my parents was actually preferable to continued third-party intervention. My father's voice was measured and reasonable, the tone he used when discussing medical treatment plans with patients who were resisting his recommendations. He wanted to discuss what he called this unfortunate misunderstanding, and find a path forward that did not involve legal action or permanent family rupture. He acknowledged that perhaps there had been occasions when my contributions to the family had not been sufficiently appreciated, and that going forward they would make more effort to express gratitude for any help I chose to provide. He suggested that the estate planning presentation had been poorly timed and poorly worded, and that they were willing to reconsider some of the provisions to ensure both daughters felt equally valued. He implied that my reaction had been disproportionate to the actual offenses committed, and that with some perspective and goodwill on all sides, the situation could be resolved without the dramatic measures I had proposed. What my father was offering was exactly what I had received throughout my life: acknowledgement of minor errors without admission of fundamental wrongdoing, vague promises of future improvement without concrete commitments, and framing of my response as excessive rather than appropriate. I recognized the pattern immediately and refused to accept the minimization of what I had experienced and documented. I responded by reminding him that I had not presented a misunderstanding, but rather 3 years of systematic documentation proving patterns of exploitation and favoritism. I noted that his call was occurring on the 6th day of the 1-week deadline I had established, which suggested he was attempting to negotiate rather than genuinely addressing the substance of my requirements. I told my father that I appreciated his willingness to have a direct conversation, but that the conversation I was willing to have was limited to whether he and my mother intended to sign the agreement I had presented. I was not interested in discussing modified versions of the agreement or alternative arrangements that preserved their comfort, while failing to address my core requirements. The agreement I had drafted represented the minimum necessary boundaries for me to continue having any relationship with them, and anything less than full agreement was equivalent to rejection. My father's reasonable tone shifted to frustration as he realized I would not be negotiated away from my position. He told me I was being unreasonable and rigid, that I was letting pride prevent me from accepting a reasonable compromise, that I was going to destroy the family over what amounted to hurt feelings and perceived slights. I responded that he was welcome to perceive my documented evidence of exploitation as hurt feelings if that allowed him to sleep better at night, but that his perception did not change the objective reality of what had occurred or the legitimacy of my response. I ended the call by repeating that he had until the end of the 7th day to provide a signed agreement, and that I would interpret any response other than a signed agreement as rejection requiring me to proceed with legal action. The 7th day arrived with a weight of finality that made every hour feel elongated and significant. I had given my parents 1 week to review comprehensive documentation of their exploitation, to consult with advisors if they chose, to search their consciences and make a decision about whether maintaining control and avoiding accountability mattered more to them than preserving relationship with their eldest daughter. The deadline I had established was midnight, at which point their silence or refusal would trigger the next phase of my strategy. I spent that final day in a state of unusual calm, having moved through the anxiety and doubt that had characterized the previous 6 days. I had done everything within my power to create an opportunity for my parents to choose relationship over pride. I had documented truth so comprehensively that it could not be denied or rewritten. I had presented requirements that were reasonable and necessary rather than punitive or excessive. I had maintained my boundaries despite emotional manipulation, third-party intervention, and attempts to minimize the legitimacy of my concerns. Whether my parents signed the agreement or refused it, I would know that I had honored myself in the truth of my experience. Rebecca Chun called me that evening to check on my emotional state, and confirmed that I was prepared for either outcome. She reminded me that if my parents refused to sign, the legal process would be lengthy and emotionally draining, that family members would likely take sides and some would judge me harshly, that the financial cost of litigation would be substantial even if I ultimately prevailed. She also reminded me that if my parents did sign the agreement, the real work of rebuilding relationship on healthier terms would only just be beginning, and that signed documents did not automatically transform ingrained patterns of behavior. I thanked Rebecca for her guidance and confirmed that I was prepared for whichever path my parents chose. I had spent 3 years building toward this moment, and I would not retreat from the boundary I had established regardless of the cost or difficulty of maintaining it. My worth was not negotiable, my truth was not debatable, and my dignity was not dependent on my parents' willingness to acknowledge it. Those principles would guide me forward whatever came next. At 11:47 that evening, 13 minutes before my deadline, my phone notification indicated an email had arrived from my father's account. The subject line read simply "Signed Agreement," and the body of the email contained a scanned copy of the single-page document I had presented, bearing both of my parents' signatures and dated that day. There was no accompanying message, no expression of understanding or apology, no indication of their emotional state or thought process. Just the signed document proving they had chosen to meet my requirements rather than face the consequences of refusal. I stared at that scanned document for a long time, feeling a complex mixture of relief, vindication, grief, and uncertainty. They had signed, which meant they acknowledged at some level that my requirements were legitimate, and that their past behavior had been problematic enough to warrant formal boundaries. But they had signed without any personal communication beyond the legalistic minimum, which suggested they viewed this as a transaction rather than as the beginning of genuine relationship repair. They were complying with my ultimatum, but whether they were genuinely committed to changing the underlying dynamics remained to be seen. I saved the signed agreement to multiple locations, printed a hard copy for my physical files, and forwarded it to Rebecca Chun with a brief note thanking her for her guidance through the process. Then I sat in my apartment surrounded by 3 years of accumulated documentation and allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had just transpired. I had forced my parents to acknowledge my worth through the threat of legal consequences, rather than through their voluntary recognition of my inherent value. That reality was simultaneously empowering and heartbreaking. Proof that I had won a battle, but unclear evidence about whether the larger war for genuine family connection could ever truly be won. The morning after receiving the signed agreement brought an unfamiliar sensation that took me several minutes to identify as I lay in bed watching early sunlight filter through my apartment windows. The feeling was not happiness or satisfaction, though elements of both existed somewhere in the complicated mixture of emotions coursing through me. Instead, what I felt most strongly was a peculiar lightness, as though some enormous weight I had been carrying for so long that I had forgotten its presence had suddenly been lifted from my shoulders. The confrontation was complete. The ultimatum had been issued and answered. The boundary had been established and, at least formally, accepted. I rose and went through my morning routine with unusual mindfulness, paying attention to small details that normally passed unnoticed in the rush to prepare for work. The temperature of the shower water, the smell of coffee brewing, the texture of fabric against my skin as I dressed for the day ahead. These ordinary sensations felt somehow more vivid in the aftermath of extraordinary emotional upheaval, as though my nervous system was recalibrating itself to process a reality that had fundamentally shifted even if the external circumstances of my life remained largely unchanged. My phone remained silent throughout the morning. With no messages from my parents beyond the terse email containing the signed agreement they had sent minutes before the deadline. Victoria had not contacted me either, which suggested she was either respecting the boundary I had requested or she was still processing her own complicated feelings about the family rupture she had witnessed. The silence felt appropriate somehow. A necessary pause between the intense confrontation that had concluded and whatever uncertain future relationship might eventually develop from the ruins of the old patterns. I arrived at my office and moved through the workday with the practiced efficiency that had made me successful in my career as a financial analyst. My colleagues had no idea that I had just spent the previous week engaged in a high-stakes family confrontation that had resulted in formal documentation of boundaries and implicit threat of litigation. The compartmentalization that allowed me to separate personal turmoil from professional responsibility was a skill I had developed over decades of managing family crisis, while maintaining external appearances of stability and competence. But that morning I wondered for the first time whether that compartmentalization was entirely healthy, or whether it represented another form of the splitting and hiding that had characterized my entire relationship with my parents. During my lunch break I called Rebecca Chun to discuss the next steps now that my parents had signed the agreement. She congratulated me on achieving what she characterized as a significant victory, noting that many adult children who attempt to establish boundaries with exploitative parents never reach the point of formal acknowledgement, because the parents refuse to participate in any process that requires them to admit wrongdoing or accept constraints on their behavior. The fact that my parents had signed, even reluctantly and at the last possible moment, indicated that they understood on some level that their previous treatment of me had been problematic enough to warrant serious consequences if they refused to change. Rebecca outlined what the coming months would likely involve as we moved from formal agreement to practical implementation. The first phase would be a period of minimal contact during which my parents would hopefully reflect on the patterns documented in my evidence and begin to internalize the reality that their behavior had caused genuine harm, rather than simply constituting normal family dynamics I was too sensitive to accept. During this phase, which she recommended last at least 1 month, I should not initiate contact with them but should respond to any contact they initiated with polite, but emotionally neutral communication that reinforced the boundaries established in the signed agreement. The second phase would involve gradual re-engagement through structured interactions that had clear purposes and time limits. These might include brief phone calls to discuss specific topics, carefully planned meals in public locations where social constraints would encourage civilized behavior, or collaborative activities that required cooperation on concrete tasks, rather than emotional processing of past hurts. The goal of this phase was to establish new patterns of interaction that respected boundaries, while allowing relationship to develop on healthier foundations than had existed previously. The third phase, which might not arrive for many months or even years, would involve deeper conversations about the past and genuine repair work on the relationship itself. This phase could only occur if my parents demonstrated through consistent behavior that they had internalized the lessons of the confrontation and were genuinely committed to treating me with the respect and consideration that the agreement required. Rebecca cautioned me not to expect or push for this third phase prematurely, noting that many family relationships stabilize in the second phase of structured, but emotionally limited interaction without ever progressing to genuine intimacy and mutual vulnerability. I thanked Rebecca for her guidance and acknowledged that the path ahead would require as much patience and discipline as the documentation phase had required. I had spent 3 years building evidence and preparing for confrontation. I would need to spend at least as long building new patterns and testing whether my parents were capable of the sustained behavioral change that genuine relationship repair would demand. The signed agreement was a beginning rather than an ending, and the real measure of success would be determined not by their signatures on a document but by their actions over time. That afternoon I drafted a brief email to my parents acknowledging receipt of the signed agreement and outlining expectations for the immediate future. I kept the tone professional rather than warm, factual rather than emotional, clear rather than ambiguous. I thanked them for their willingness to formalize the boundaries we had discussed, and confirmed that I considered the agreement to be a binding commitment that would govern our future interactions. I explained that I would not be initiating contact with them for the next several weeks to allow all of us time to process what had occurred and to adjust to the new terms of our relationship. I noted that I remained available if they wished to contact me, but that any contact should be consistent with the respect and equal treatment outlined in the agreement we had all signed. I also sent a separate email to Victoria, who had been uncharacteristically silent since her tearful visit to my apartment several days earlier. I told her that our parents had signed the agreement before the deadline, and that I hoped this formal acknowledgement would ultimately lead to healthier family dynamics that would benefit everyone involved, including her. I reiterated that I did not expect her to choose sides or to serve as a mediator, and that my love for her was not conditional on her response to the conflict between our parents and myself. I invited her to contact me whenever she felt ready to talk, whether about the family situation or about anything else in her life that she wanted to share. The days following my acknowledgement email passed with a strange quality of suspended animation. My routine continued unchanged on the surface, with work responsibilities and personal activities filling my time in familiar patterns. But underneath the surface normalcy, I felt a constant low-level awareness that something fundamental had shifted in my internal landscape. I had forced my parents to acknowledge my worth through documentation and ultimatum, rather than through their voluntary recognition of my inherent value. That reality created a complicated mixture of empowerment and grief that defied simple emotional categorization. I found myself thinking often about what genuine family relationships should look like and wondering whether such a thing was even possible between people whose entire history together was built on exploitation and favoritism, rather than mutual respect and unconditional love. The therapeutic literature I had been reading suggested that family relationships damaged in childhood could be repaired in adulthood if all parties were willing to engage in honest communication and sustained behavioral change. But that same literature acknowledged that many damaged family relationships could not be fully repaired, and that sometimes the healthiest choice was to maintain formal connection, while accepting that genuine intimacy would never be possible. Victoria called me 8 days after the signed agreement arrived, and the sound of her voice carried a tentative quality that suggested she was uncertain about how I would receive her contact. We spoke for over an hour, with Victoria asking questions about my decision-making process and my feelings about the confrontation now that some time had passed. I answered her questions honestly, explaining that I felt no regret about establishing boundaries, even though the process had been painful, and that I hoped eventually our parents would recognize that the boundaries served everyone's well-being, rather than simply punishing them for past behavior. Victoria shared her own complicated feelings about the family dynamics that my confrontation had exposed. She acknowledged that she had been vaguely aware of disparate treatment between us throughout our lives, but that she had rationalized the disparity by telling herself that I was more capable and therefore needed less support, or that our parents expressed love differently to different children based on individual temperament and needs. The comprehensive documentation I had presented made it impossible for her to maintain those rationalizations, and she was struggling to reconcile the parents she had believed she knew with the evidence of their treatment of me. I told Victoria something that I had come to understand through my own processing of the confrontation and its aftermath. Our parents were not monsters or villains engaged in deliberate cruelty toward me. They were flawed human beings who had internalized certain beliefs about family obligation and parental entitlement, who had developed patterns of behavior that served their emotional and practical needs without full awareness of the cost those patterns extracted from me, and who had convinced themselves that their treatment of both daughters was appropriate and justified. Understanding this did not excuse their behavior or eliminate my need for boundaries, but it did allow me to hold them accountable without dehumanizing them or requiring myself to hate them in order to protect myself from them. Victoria asked whether I thought our family could ever return to some version of normal, and I gave her the most honest answer I could formulate. Normal as it had existed previously was precisely what I had disrupted through my confrontation, because that version of normal had required me to accept diminishment and exploitation as the price of family connection. We could not return to that normal, nor would I want to even if it were possible. What we might eventually build was something different. A relationship structure based on explicit boundaries and mutual respect, rather than on unstated hierarchies and unequal obligations. Whether our parents were capable of participating in that different kind of relationship remained to be seen, and would be determined by their behavior over time rather than by their signatures on an agreement. The conversation with Victoria left me feeling more settled about the family situation than I had felt since the confrontation itself. Her willingness to hear my perspective without demanding that I soften my position or accommodate our parents' discomfort suggested that she was capable of the nuanced thinking that the situation required. She loved our parents and wanted the family to remain intact, but she was also beginning to recognize that intact did not necessarily mean unchanged, and that sometimes the most loving thing one can do is to insist on truth and boundaries rather than to enable continued dysfunction for the sake of false harmony. 2 weeks after the signed agreement arrived, my father called my cell phone on a weekday evening. I answered with some trepidation, uncertain what tone he would take or what purpose his call would serve. His voice when he spoke carried none of the defensive anger that had characterized his response during the initial confrontation. Instead, he sounded tired and somewhat formal, as though he was fulfilling an obligation he found difficult but necessary. He told me that he and my mother had been discussing the documentation I had presented and the boundaries I had established, and that they wanted to acknowledge that some of my grievances had merit even if they did not agree with all of my characterizations or conclusions. This qualified acknowledgement was hardly the wholehearted acceptance and apology I might have wished for, but I recognized it as potentially significant progress for people who had spent decades convinced that their parenting had been beyond reproach. I thanked my father for his willingness to consider my perspective and asked what specifically he and my mother had come to recognize as legitimate concerns within my documentation. His answer revealed that they had focused primarily on the financial disparities between their treatment of Victoria and their treatment of me, which were the most objectively measurable elements of my evidence, and therefore the most difficult to dismiss or reframe. My father explained that they had not fully realized how much more financial support they had provided to Victoria over the years, compared to what they had provided to me. They had justified each individual decision about resource allocation based on what seemed necessary or appropriate at the time, without stepping back to examine the cumulative pattern of those decisions. Seeing the comprehensive accounting I had created made the disparity undeniable, and they acknowledged that this disparity had been unfair regardless of their intentions or rationalizations. He said they were in the process of revising their estate plan to ensure more equal treatment going forward, and that they wanted me to know about this change as evidence of their commitment to honoring the agreement they had signed. I appreciated this concrete action more than I would have appreciated elaborate emotional apologies, because changing their estate plan required them to take tangible steps that would have lasting legal and financial consequences. Words were easy to offer and easy to retract. Legal documents were more substantial evidence of genuine commitment to behavioral change. I told my father that I welcomed the revision to their estate planning, and that I hoped it reflected the beginning of broader changes in how they thought about both daughters and their respective relationships with each of us. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with my father asking careful questions about what kind of relationship I hoped to build with them going forward, and what specific behaviors would demonstrate to me that they were honoring the boundaries established in the signed agreement. I answered these questions thoughtfully, appreciating that he was asking rather than assuming or dismissing my needs as unreasonable. I explained that I hoped eventually we could develop a relationship characterized by mutual respect, honest communication, and equitable treatment, but that reaching that goal would require sustained effort over time, rather than a single conversation or gesture. I told my father that the behaviors I most needed to see from both him and my mother included acknowledgement of my contributions without minimizing or reframing them as simple family obligation, requests for my professional assistance that included discussion of appropriate compensation rather than assumption that I would work for free, invitations to family gatherings that did not come with implicit expectations that I would perform unpaid labor, and most importantly, an end to language that position me as ungrateful or as less valuable than Victoria. These were not extraordinary requirements but rather the basic elements of respectful adult relationships, and my hope was that with time they would become natural rather than effortful. When the call ended, I felt cautiously optimistic for the first time since the confrontation had occurred. My father's willingness to initiate contact, to ask genuine questions, and to report concrete actions they were taking suggested that he and my mother were at least attempting to respond constructively to the boundaries I had established. Whether this initial attempt would develop into sustained behavioral change remained uncertain, but the fact that they were making an attempt rather than simply signing the agreement under duress and then ignoring its requirements was more than I had dared to expect in the immediate aftermath of my ultimatum. I updated Rebecca Chun on the conversation with my father and the reported changes to their estate planning. She cautioned me to remain vigilant about testing whether their behavioral changes were genuine and sustained, rather than temporary performances designed to placate me until I lowered my guard. She recommended that I continue documenting our interactions for the foreseeable future, noting patterns of behavior that either supported or contradicted their stated commitment to honoring the agreement. This ongoing documentation would serve multiple purposes, including providing early warning if they began to slip back into old patterns, creating evidence for potential legal action if the agreement was violated, and helping me to see clearly over time whether genuine progress was occurring or whether I was being manipulated into accepting symbolic gestures in place of meaningful change. The following weeks brought gradual increases in contact with my parents, all initiated by them and all carefully respectful of the boundaries I had established. My mother sent a brief email apologizing for calling me a parasite during the confrontation, and acknowledging that the language had been cruel and unfair regardless of how angry or defensive she felt in that moment. The apology was somewhat stiff and formal, lacking the emotional depth that a truly processed acknowledgement of harm might have contained, but it represented more accountability than she had offered for any previous hurt she had caused throughout my entire life. My parents invited me to a Sunday dinner 6 weeks after the confrontation, framing the invitation as an opportunity to discuss the revised estate plan they had developed, and to have what they termed a fresh start in our relationship. I accepted the invitation with clear conditions, including that the dinner would last no more than 2 hours, that we would not rehash the past beyond what was necessary to discuss the estate changes, and that Victoria would also be present so that we could all hear the new arrangements together rather than having information filtered through multiple conversations. As I prepared for that Sunday dinner, I reflected on how dramatically different my emotional state was compared to the last Sunday dinner I had attended in the Victorian house on Elmwood Avenue. The previous time I had entered that dining room carrying an envelope filled with documentation and ultimatum, prepared for confrontation and uncertain about whether I would have the courage to follow through with the boundary I had decided to establish. This time I was entering from a position of established power, with a signed agreement in place and evidence that my parents were at least attempting to honor its terms. The uncertainty that remained was not about whether I could enforce my boundaries, but rather about whether enforcing those boundaries would ultimately lead to genuine relationship repair, or simply to formal coexistence without authentic connection. The dinner itself unfolded with a careful civility that felt both encouraging and somewhat sad. We were like diplomats from nations with complicated histories, polite and respectful, but lacking the ease and warmth that characterize relationships built on trust and mutual affection. My parents presented the revised estate plan that distributed their assets equally between Victoria and myself, and they acknowledged explicitly that the previous plan had been inequitable in ways they had not fully recognized until I forced them to examine the cumulative pattern of their decisions. Victoria listened with obvious relief, grateful that the family was finding its way toward resolution rather than permanent rupture. As I drove home from that dinner, I felt something I had not felt in my parents' presence for as long as I could remember. I felt seen. Not fully understood perhaps, not unconditionally loved in the way every child deserves, but genuinely seen as a person with legitimate needs and boundaries that deserved respect. The seeing had required me to force recognition through documentation and ultimatum rather than being freely offered. That reality would always carry some sadness. But the seeing itself, however it had been achieved, created the possibility that relationship might eventually develop where previously only obligation and exploitation had existed. Whether that possibility would be realized remained uncertain, but for the first time in my life I believed it might actually be achievable if all of us remained committed to the difficult work that genuine change requires. The months following that first carefully orchestrated Sunday dinner brought a gradual evolution in my relationship with my parents that felt less like healing and more like the construction of an entirely new structure on ground where the old foundation had been demolished. The signed agreement remained the framework that governed our interactions, a constant reminder that trust had been broken and would need to be rebuilt through consistent behavior rather than through promises or good intentions. I approached each interaction with my parents as a data point in an ongoing analysis, gathering evidence about whether their stated commitment to change was translating into sustained behavioral modification, or whether the initial gestures of respect and equality would prove to be temporary performances designed to appease me until I lowered my vigilance. The first test of their commitment came approximately 8 weeks after the revised estate plan discussion. My father called to ask if I would be willing to review some financial documents related to a real estate investment opportunity he was considering with several colleagues from the hospital. The request itself was not unusual, as reviewing financial documents had been among my primary unpaid contributions to my parents throughout my adult life. What made this request different was the way my father framed it, and the conversation that followed when I asked clarifying questions about his expectations. Rather than assuming I would automatically provide this service without compensation or discussion, my father acknowledged that he was requesting professional financial analysis that would require several hours of my time and expertise. He asked what my hourly rate would be for this type of consulting work, and when I provided the figure that I charged to clients outside my regular employment, he agreed to those terms without attempting to negotiate or to invoke family obligation as justification for reduced compensation. He also clarified that the timeline for the analysis was flexible, and asked what would be reasonable given my other professional commitments, rather than expecting me to prioritize his needs over my own schedule. This single interaction represented a fundamental departure from decades of established patterns. My father was treating me as a professional consultant whose time had monetary value, rather than as a daughter whose services were owed as repayment for the gift of life and upbringing. The shift felt simultaneously validating and somewhat melancholy, because it meant that even positive changes in our relationship were occurring within a transactional framework, rather than within a context of generosity freely offered and received. I completed the financial analysis over the following week, provided my father with a comprehensive report and recommendations, and sent him an invoice for my services that he paid promptly without comment or complaint. The significance of this transaction extended beyond the payment itself, though the payment was symbolically important as acknowledgement that my expertise had monetary value. What mattered more was that my father had internalized the boundary about unpaid labor expectations, and had modified his behavior accordingly without requiring me to remind him, or to enforce consequences for violation. He had taken responsibility for understanding the terms of our agreement, and for complying with those terms proactively rather than reactively. This suggested that at least some level of genuine behavioral change was occurring rather than simple compliance under threat. My mother's adjustment to the new boundaries proved more complicated, and revealed the depth of her resistance to acknowledging that her treatment of me had been problematic. She maintained formal compliance with the signed agreement by avoiding explicitly diminishing language, and by including me in family communications and events on equal footing with Victoria. However, her emotional withdrawal was palpable in every interaction we had during those first several months. She spoke to me with the polite distance one might use with a business acquaintance rather than with a daughter, carefully avoiding any topic that might lead to emotional vulnerability or authentic connection. During a family birthday celebration for Victoria held 3 months after the confrontation, I observed my mother's interactions with both daughters with the analytical attention I had developed through years of documenting family patterns. With Victoria she was warm and engaged, asking detailed questions about her life, and offering unsolicited advice and support in the manner of a mother who felt secure in her relationship with her child. With me she was cordial but guarded, limiting our conversation to surface topics and practical matters, while maintaining careful emotional distance. The contrast was obvious enough that Victoria noticed and later asked me privately whether I thought our mother would ever be able to move past her resentment about being forced to acknowledge wrongdoing. I told Victoria something I had been thinking about extensively during my own processing of how the family dynamics were evolving. Our mother had built her entire self-concept around being a good parent, who had sacrificed her own ambitions to raise children, and who deserved gratitude and deference for those sacrifices. My confrontation had shattered that self-concept by presenting undeniable evidence that her parenting had included exploitation and favoritism, rather than selfless devotion to both children equally. For my mother to fully engage with me now would require her to hold two contradictory ideas simultaneously: that she loved both daughters and that she had harmed one of them significantly through years of unequal treatment. That cognitive dissonance was apparently too uncomfortable for her to navigate, so she was choosing instead to maintain distance that allowed her to comply with the agreement without fully confronting the implications of why the agreement had been necessary. I explained to Victoria that I had made peace with the possibility that my mother might never be capable of the deeper emotional work that genuine relationship repair would require. The signed agreement had achieved my primary objectives of establishing boundaries and ensuring more equitable treatment going forward. If those boundaries remained in place and the equitable treatment continued, I could build a satisfactory if not deeply fulfilling relationship with both parents based on mutual respect, even without the emotional intimacy that ideally would characterize parent-child relationships. This represented a compromise between my desires for what family should be and my acceptance of what this particular family was realistically capable of becoming. The 4th month after the confrontation brought an unexpected development that tested my boundaries in a different way. My mother was diagnosed with early-stage breast cancer that would require surgery followed by several months of treatment. Victoria called to tell me about the diagnosis before my parents had contacted me themselves, and she asked whether I would be willing to provide support during the treatment process despite the ongoing tensions in our relationship. The question forced me to examine my own principles about what I owed to parents who had exploited me for years, but who were now facing a genuine medical crisis that would require practical and emotional support. I spent several days thinking carefully about how to respond to this situation, in a way that honored both my boundaries and my values. I consulted with Rebecca Chun about whether providing support during a medical crisis would undermine the boundaries I had established, or whether it was possible to offer help during extraordinary circumstances without reverting to old patterns of unlimited unpaid obligation. Rebecca helped me understand that boundaries are not rigid walls that must be maintained identically under all circumstances, but rather flexible frameworks that can accommodate extraordinary situations while still protecting against exploitation. I decided to reach out directly to both parents and offer specific, limited support during my mother's treatment. I explained that I was willing to help coordinate medical appointments and insurance communications given my experience with navigating healthcare systems during my own mother's illness years earlier. I offered to be present for major medical procedures if they wanted family support in the hospital. I volunteered to help research treatment options and second opinions if that would be useful. However, I also clarified that this support was being offered freely during a medical crisis, and did not represent a return to previous patterns of unlimited availability for any need or request they might have. The boundaries established in our agreement remained in place, and my willingness to help during this specific situation should not be interpreted as permission to resume taking my labor and expertise for granted once the immediate crisis had passed. My parents accepted my offer of support with what seemed like genuine gratitude, and over the following months I helped them navigate the practical complexities of cancer treatment, while maintaining clear limits about what I would and would not do. I attended pre-surgical consultations and took notes about treatment options. I researched oncologists and treatment centers to help them make informed decisions about care. I was present in the hospital during my mother's surgery, and stayed with my father in the waiting room during the long hours of uncertainty. But I did not move back into old patterns of managing every detail of their lives or sacrificing my own needs to accommodate their preferences about how support should be provided. The experience of supporting my mother through cancer treatment, while maintaining boundaries, taught me something important about the distinction between healthy interdependence and exploitative obligation. Healthy interdependence means offering help during genuine crises, while respecting limits about what the helper can reasonably provide without harm to themselves. Exploitative obligation means demanding unlimited availability and sacrifice from specific family members, while treating that sacrifice as owed rather than as a gift freely given. I was able to show up for my mother during her illness because I was choosing to do so based on my own values about compassion and family support, not because I felt obligated by guilt or fear of being labeled ungrateful if I refused. My mother's response to my support during her illness revealed something about her capacity for change that I had not previously seen. She expressed appreciation for my help in ways that seemed genuine rather than performative, acknowledging specific contributions I made and recognizing that I was going out of my way to be present during a difficult time. She asked rather than demanded when she needed something, and she accepted my limits when I explained that certain requests exceeded what I could reasonably provide given my other responsibilities. The medical crisis seemed to have created a context in which she could receive help from me without triggering the complex emotions that normal circumstances produced, perhaps because serious illness made it easier for her to acknowledge vulnerability and need without experiencing that acknowledgement as diminishment. During one of the medical appointments I attended with both parents, my mother said something that suggested she had been doing some of the internal reflection I had hoped would eventually occur. We were waiting in an examination room for the oncologist to arrive and discussing the treatment timeline when my mother suddenly shifted the conversation to something more personal. She told me that facing cancer had forced her to think about mortality and legacy, about what she would be remembered for, and whether she had been the kind of person she wanted to be during her time on Earth. She said that one of her greatest regrets was that she had not recognized sooner how much she had asked of me over the years and how little she had given in return, and that she hoped she would have time to do better going forward. This acknowledgement was not a comprehensive apology or a complete acceptance of responsibility for the patterns I had documented. It was hedged with qualifications about not recognizing rather than choosing, about hoping to do better rather than committing to specific changes. But it represented more authentic emotional engagement with the reality of how she had treated me than anything she had offered in the immediate aftermath of the confrontation. I accepted her words with appreciation for the effort they represented while maintaining realistic expectations about how much actual change would follow from this single moment of clarity. The cancer treatment extended over 6 months, during which time I maintained consistent but boundaried support for both parents. I learned to distinguish between requests that were reasonable given the circumstances and requests that represented attempts to expand my role beyond what I had agreed to provide. When my father asked if I would consider temporarily managing his medical practice finances while he focused on supporting my mother through treatment, I declined and instead helped him hire a part-time bookkeeper who could handle those responsibilities. When my mother asked if I would coordinate meal preparation for the weeks when she would be too sick from chemotherapy to cook, I organized a meal train through their church community rather than taking on the cooking myself. These decisions to maintain boundaries even during a medical crisis sometimes felt harsh or ungenerous, particularly when I compared myself to the version of myself who would have automatically sacrificed everything to meet any need my parents expressed. But I reminded myself that healthy boundaries serve everyone's long-term interests, even when they create short-term discomfort, and that teaching my parents to seek support from multiple sources rather than depending entirely on me was ultimately better for all of us. My role was to be a supportive daughter during a difficult time, not to be the solution to every problem or the answer to every need. Victoria's observation of how I navigated this period seemed to influence her own thinking about family dynamics and obligations. She commented several times that she was learning from watching me maintain boundaries, while still showing up with genuine care and support. She acknowledged that she had always assumed family obligation meant saying yes to every request and sacrificing personal limits whenever a family member expressed need, and that she was beginning to understand that unlimited sacrifice was neither sustainable nor ultimately healthy for anyone involved. This evolution in Victoria's thinking created an unexpected benefit from the difficult work I had done to establish boundaries, as she began applying similar principles to her own relationship with our parents. By the time my mother completed her cancer treatment and received positive reports about her prognosis, our family had established what might be described as a new equilibrium. The relationships between all of us had been fundamentally restructured around principles of explicit boundaries, equitable treatment, and mutual respect, rather than around unstated hierarchies and unequal obligations. The new structure lacked some of the warmth and ease that ideally would characterize family relationships, but it also lacked the exploitation and resentment that had poisoned the old structure. We were building something different from what had existed before, and while that something was not perfect, it was substantially healthier and more sustainable than the patterns it had replaced. The anniversary of the confrontation arrived without fanfare or discussion, marked only by my private reflection on how dramatically my life and my family relationships had changed over the course of 12 months. I had entered that Sunday dinner a year earlier carrying an envelope filled with documentation and ultimatum. Uncertain about whether I would have the courage to follow through with the boundary, I had decided to establish and terrified about the potential consequences of forcing my parents to acknowledge patterns they had spent decades denying. I had emerged from that confrontation and the difficult months that followed with something I had never possessed in my relationship with my parents. The security that came from knowing my worth was established and protected by formal agreements and demonstrated behavioral change, rather than dependent on their willingness to recognize my value. The work of maintaining boundaries and testing whether genuine relationship repair was occurring continued to require vigilance and effort. I documented interactions, noted patterns, and remained alert to signs that old dynamics might be reasserting themselves beneath the surface of compliance with formal agreements. But the exhausting hypervigilance of the documentation phase had given way to something more sustainable, a kind of informed awareness that allowed me to engage with my parents without constant anxiety about whether I was being exploited or whether my contributions were being taken for granted. The signed agreement had created a safety net that allowed for relationship without requiring me to be constantly on guard against boundary violations. Perhaps most importantly, the process of confronting my parents and establishing boundaries had taught me something fundamental about my own capacity for self-advocacy and principled action, in the face of enormous social and emotional pressure, to maintain false harmony. I had proven to myself that I could document truth comprehensively, present it clearly, establish boundaries firmly, and maintain those boundaries consistently despite manipulation, guilt, and the very real possibility of permanent family rupture. That self-knowledge was valuable far beyond the specific context of my family relationships, as it informed how I approached all situations where power imbalances and exploitation might occur. The transformation in my family relationships created unexpected consequences that extended far beyond the immediate circle of parents and siblings. Extended family members who had observed the initial confrontation through second-hand reports and rumors gradually became aware that something fundamental had shifted in the Whitmore family dynamics, and their responses to this shift revealed much about the systems of obligation and denial that operated within the broader family network. The boundary I had established with my parents functioned like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that reached distant shores and disturbed settled patterns in ways I had not anticipated when I first handed my mother that envelope. My Aunt Margaret, who had called me weeks after the confrontation in an unsuccessful attempt to pressure me into withdrawing my ultimatum, maintained her distance for nearly 6 months before reaching out again with a request that revealed both her discomfort with the new family dynamic and her gradual recognition that I would not be returning to my previous role. She called on a Tuesday evening to ask if I would be willing to help her elderly mother, my grandmother Eleanor, with some estate planning matters that required financial expertise. The request itself was reasonable, as my grandmother was 92 years old and needed assistance navigating complex decisions about asset distribution and long-term care planning. What made the request significant was not the substance but rather the framing. Margaret approached me as she would approach a professional consultant, asking about my availability and acknowledging that she expected to compensate me for my time, rather than assuming I would provide family assistance without discussion of payment. She explained that she had observed how I handled the boundary establishment with my parents, and had concluded that the old assumptions about family members providing unlimited unpaid service were no longer operative, at least where I was concerned. Her tone carried a mixture of respect and resentment, as though she recognized the legitimacy of my boundaries, while simultaneously resenting the disruption those boundaries created in the comfortable patterns where certain family members provided labor, while others consumed it. I agreed to help my grandmother with her estate planning and quoted Margaret the professional rate I charged for such work. The rate was substantial but fair given the complexity of the work involved and my level of expertise. Margaret accepted the terms without negotiation, and over the following month I worked directly with my grandmother to create a comprehensive estate plan that reflected her wishes and protected her interests. The experience was gratifying in ways that previous family assistance had never been, because I was providing service that was valued appropriately rather than taken for granted, and because my grandmother expressed genuine appreciation for my expertise rather than treating my contributions as obligation owed. During one of our planning sessions, my grandmother made a comment that suggested she had been paying closer attention to family dynamics than I had realized. She told me that she had heard about the confrontation with my parents and about the formal agreement I had required them to sign, and that while she did not know all the details, she admired my willingness to establish clear boundaries even when doing so created family tension. She shared that in her own life she had often allowed herself to be taken advantage of by family members who assumed her resources and time were available without limit, and that she regretted not having established firmer boundaries when she was younger and had more energy to enforce them. My grandmother's words carried weight, because she represented a generation that had been taught that family harmony required women to sacrifice indefinitely without complaint or expectation of reciprocity. Her acknowledgement that boundaries might have served her better than unlimited accommodation suggested that the family patterns I had challenged were not simply the result of my parents' individual failings, but rather reflected broader cultural and generational assumptions about obligation and sacrifice. This recognition helped me maintain perspective about the work I was doing to restructure family relationships, understanding it as part of a larger shift in how people thought about autonomy and interdependence rather than as purely personal grievance. The work with my grandmother also brought me into closer contact with other extended family members who had their own complicated relationships with obligation and boundary setting. A cousin named Jennifer, who was roughly my age, reached out after hearing that I had helped our grandmother with estate planning. Jennifer explained that she had been struggling for years with her own parents' expectations of unpaid labor and emotional support that exceeded what she could reasonably provide, while maintaining her own well-being and professional responsibilities. She asked if I would be willing to meet for coffee to discuss how I had managed to establish boundaries with my parents without completely destroying the relationship. The conversation with Jennifer revealed that my confrontation with my parents had created a kind of permission structure for other family members who had been quietly suffering under similar patterns of exploitation, but had not imagined that challenging those patterns was possible. Jennifer described dynamics in her immediate family that closely paralleled what I had experienced, including disparate treatment between siblings, expectations of unpaid professional services, and language that characterized any resistance to unlimited availability as selfishness or ingratitude. She had watched my boundary-setting process from a distance, and had been inspired by my willingness to document patterns and require formal acknowledgement of problematic behavior. I shared with Jennifer the strategic framework I had used to establish boundaries, including the importance of comprehensive documentation, the value of professional legal consultation, the necessity of clear communication about expectations and consequences, and the discipline required to maintain boundaries consistently even in the face of emotional manipulation and social pressure. I also shared the more difficult truths about the costs of boundary setting, including the reality that some family relationships might never recover the warmth they previously possessed, and the ongoing vigilance required to prevent gradual erosion of hard-won limits. Jennifer listened with the intensity of someone who was gathering courage for a difficult conversation she knew she would eventually need to have, and I felt honored to provide guidance that might help her avoid some of the mistakes I had made during my own process. The connection with Jennifer evolved into an ongoing friendship that provided mutual support as we each navigated complicated family dynamics. We met regularly to share experiences and strategies, celebrating small victories when boundaries were respected, and providing encouragement during setbacks when old patterns temporarily reasserted themselves. The friendship also helped me recognize that my experience was not unique or isolated, that many people struggled with family systems that demanded unlimited sacrifice from certain members, while protecting others from similar expectations. This recognition reduced the shame I had sometimes felt about needing to establish formal boundaries with my own parents, understanding that the need for such boundaries reflected systemic problems, rather than individual failings on anyone's part. 6 months after the cancer treatment concluded, my parents invited both Victoria and me to a family meeting to discuss what they described as important reflections they wanted to share about the past year and their hopes for the future. The invitation was carefully worded to emphasize that this was not an ambush or an attempt to renegotiate the boundaries that had been established, but rather an opportunity for them to communicate thoughts they had been processing during the difficult months of medical treatment and recovery. I accepted the invitation with cautious curiosity, interested to hear what they wanted to say but prepared to reinforce boundaries if the conversation veered into territory that violated our agreement. The meeting took place on a Saturday afternoon at their house, with all four of us gathered in the living room that had been the site of so many previous family gatherings, both harmonious and tense. My father began by acknowledging that the past year had been the most difficult of their marriage, not only because of the cancer diagnosis and treatment, but also because of the forced reckoning with patterns of behavior they had never previously examined. He explained that my confrontation had initially felt like an attack and a betrayal, but that over time he had come to recognize it as a necessary intervention that had prevented the family relationships from deteriorating beyond the point of repair. My mother spoke next, and her words carried more emotional weight than anything she had said to me since the original confrontation. She acknowledged that she had been defensive and angry in the immediate aftermath of being forced to sign the agreement, that she had felt ambushed and unfairly characterized as a bad mother, when she had genuinely believed she was doing her best for both daughters. But the experience of cancer treatment had given her perspective about what truly mattered, and she had concluded that maintaining pride and defending her self-image was less important than building genuine relationship with both daughters during whatever time remained to her. She apologized specifically for calling me a parasite, acknowledging that the word had been chosen deliberately to wound, and that it reflected her own fear about losing control over family dynamics, rather than any legitimate assessment of my contributions to the family. The apology was more complete and emotionally authentic than anything I had expected to receive from my mother, and I found myself unexpectedly moved by her willingness to acknowledge not just the specific incident, but also the underlying fear and control issues that had motivated her hurtful language. I thanked her for the apology and acknowledged that I understood the confrontation had been painful for her, even though I maintained that it had been necessary given the patterns that had developed over decades. I explained that my goal had never been to punish her or to force her to see herself as a bad mother, but rather to establish boundaries that would allow us to build a healthier relationship going forward, based on mutual respect, rather than exploitation. Victoria contributed to the conversation by sharing her own perspective on how the family dynamics had affected her, revealing dimensions of the situation I had not fully appreciated. She explained that while she had materially benefited from being the favored daughter, she had also suffered from the pressure to remain in that favored position by never challenging our parents or developing too much independence that might threaten their need to feel necessary. She had watched me establish boundaries with a mixture of envy and fear, envious of the autonomy I was claiming but fearful that similar boundary setting on her part would result in loss of the approval and support she had come to depend upon. The past year had taught her that genuine relationship required authenticity, rather than performance of expected roles, and she was beginning her own process of establishing healthier patterns with our parents, even though her process looked different from mine, given the different dynamics involved. My father then shared something that provided important context for understanding the family patterns that had developed over decades. He explained that his own upbringing had been characterized by emotional distance and rigid hierarchy, with his father ruling the household through intimidation, and his mother maintaining peace through appeasement and sacrifice. He had unconsciously replicated some of those patterns in his own family despite genuinely believing he was creating something different and better. Seeing the comprehensive documentation I had created about disparate treatment and exploitation had forced him to recognize that good intentions were insufficient protection against repeating intergenerational patterns, and that genuine change required conscious effort to examine and modify ingrained behaviors. This sharing of family history helped me understand that the patterns I had challenged were not simply about my parents' individual choices, but rather reflected trauma and dysfunction that extended back through generations. This understanding did not excuse the harm those patterns had caused, but it did create space for compassion alongside accountability. My parents were not monsters who had deliberately set out to exploit one daughter while favoring another, but rather damaged people who had unconsciously recreated dynamics from their own childhoods without full awareness of the costs those dynamics extracted from their children. Recognizing this allowed me to hold them responsible for their behavior, while also acknowledging the complexity of how such patterns develop and persist across generations. The family meeting concluded with a discussion about how we might continue to improve our relationships going forward. My parents expressed commitment to maintaining the boundaries established in the signed agreement, while also hoping that over time we might develop enough trust to allow for more spontaneous and emotionally intimate interactions that did not require constant reference to formal documentation. I acknowledged that this was my hope as well, but that reaching that point would require continued demonstration through behavior that the changed patterns were genuine and sustainable, rather than temporary accommodation designed to appease me until I lowered my vigilance. We agreed to continue with quarterly family meetings where we could explicitly discuss how the relationships were functioning and address any concerns before they developed into larger conflicts. This structure provided a formal mechanism for ongoing communication about boundaries and expectations, reducing the likelihood that unstated assumptions would gradually recreate problematic patterns. The meetings would serve as checkpoints where we could assess progress, acknowledge successes, identify areas needing additional attention, and make adjustments to our agreements as circumstances evolved. In the weeks following that family meeting, I reflected extensively on the journey I had traveled over the past 18 months from the initial confrontation through the gradual rebuilding of family relationships on healthier foundations. The process had been far more difficult and complicated than I had anticipated when I first began documenting the patterns of exploitation and favoritism. There had been moments when I questioned whether the cost of boundary setting was worth the benefits gained, whether maintaining some version of the old dynamics might have been easier than enduring the pain and uncertainty of forcing fundamental change. But ultimately I concluded that the difficulty of the process had been necessary and worthwhile, because the alternative was continuing to live in patterns that diminished my humanity and extracted unsustainable costs to my well-being and self-respect. The family relationships I now possess were imperfect and sometimes awkward, still bearing the scars of past harm and the tension of ongoing adjustment to new patterns. But they were also more honest and equitable than anything that had existed before, built on explicit agreements and demonstrated behavioral change, rather than on unstated hierarchies and unexamined assumptions about obligation. The experience had also taught me valuable lessons about agency and self-advocacy that extended far beyond the specific context of family relationships. I had learned that comprehensive documentation could transform subjective experiences of harm into objective evidence that was difficult to dismiss or reframe. I had learned that clear communication of boundaries and consequences was essential for ensuring that limits would be respected, rather than ignored or violated. I had learned that maintaining boundaries required consistent enforcement, even when doing so felt harsh or ungenerous in specific moments. Most importantly, I had learned that my worth was not dependent on others' recognition or validation, but rather was inherent and could be protected through strategic action, even when facing powerful opposition. These lessons informed how I approached all relationships and situations where power imbalances might create potential for exploitation. I became more attuned to early warning signs of dynamics where my contributions were being taken for granted, or where expectations were being placed upon me, without corresponding respect for my autonomy and limits. I developed greater confidence in my ability to articulate boundaries clearly, and to enforce consequences when those boundaries were violated. I learned to distinguish between healthy interdependence that involved mutual support and reciprocity, an unhealthy obligation that demanded unlimited sacrifice from specific individuals, while treating that sacrifice as owed rather than freely given. The professional benefits of the personal growth I experienced through this process were substantial and somewhat unexpected. My increased confidence in setting boundaries and advocating for my worth translated directly into my career advancement, as I became more willing to negotiate for appropriate compensation, and to decline assignments that would have required me to work beyond reasonable limits without corresponding recognition or reward. My enhanced ability to document patterns and present evidence clearly improved my effectiveness in my role as a financial analyst, where similar skills were essential for building persuasive cases about investment opportunities or risk assessments. Colleagues began seeking my advice about navigating difficult workplace dynamics or establishing boundaries with demanding supervisors, recognizing that I had developed expertise in these areas through my personal experiences. I found satisfaction in sharing strategies and frameworks that had proven effective in my own boundary-setting work, knowing that the difficult lessons I had learned might help others avoid similar struggles or navigate them more effectively. This mentoring role created meaning from the pain I had experienced, transforming personal struggle into knowledge that could benefit a broader community. The anniversary of my mother's cancer diagnosis arrived with recognition that the medical crisis had functioned as an unexpected catalyst for deeper relationship repair than might have occurred without the forced vulnerability and reflection that serious illness produced. While I would never have wished for her to face cancer, I acknowledged that the experience had created conditions where genuine emotional engagement became possible in ways that ordinary circumstances had not facilitated. The crisis had stripped away some of the defensive pride that had prevented my mother from acknowledging harm she had caused, and had created space for the kind of honest conversation about past patterns and future hopes that might otherwise have remained impossible. As I reflected on the journey from confrontation through crisis to gradual healing, I recognized that family relationship repair was not a linear process with a clear endpoint where everything would be permanently resolved. Instead, it was an ongoing practice of maintaining boundaries, testing patterns, addressing violations, celebrating progress, and accepting that some damage could be managed but never completely healed. The work would continue indefinitely, requiring sustained attention and effort from all parties involved. But the foundation had been established through the signed agreement and the demonstrated behavioral changes that followed, creating the possibility that genuine relationship might eventually emerge where previously only exploitation and resentment had existed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.